Let's begin with Story 1. Story 1. The Gentle Buzz, Maya Beekeepers and the Stingless Melipona Bee. You awaken, metaphorically, in a quiet forest of the Yucatan Peninsula, long before the arrival of Spanish ships. The air is thick with humidity, carrying with it the scent of tropical flora, the rustle of palm leaves, and a subtle hum, a near-silent droning that pulses just beneath your awareness. It is not the angry buzz of European bees, but a gentler sound, almost meditative, emitted by the stingless Melipona beechi, the sacred bee of the ancient Maya. While honey today may conjure images of golden bears on supermarket shelves or tightly packed hives on farmland, for the Maya, honey was less a product and more a divine offering. It was medicine, food, and metaphor. It was gathered, not harvested, from logs or hollow trees in a process that took weeks, sometimes months. These bees did not sting, but they required patience and almost spiritual patience that the Maya had cultivated over centuries. The Maya word for bee was Zunankab, meaning royal lady of honey, an indicator of reverence, of recognition. And while modern beekeeping may rely on suits and smoke, the ancient Maya practiced their art with bare hands, bare arms, and a trust that seems almost alien today. But let us begin not with the honey, but with the structure and object of wood and clay, the log hive. Log hives, home of the calm bee. Maya beekeepers did not build hives the way European or modern ones are structured. Instead, they used hollow logs known as jawbones, usually between 60–80 centimeters in length. These logs were carefully selected from tree species like the Dzilche, Gymnopodium floribundum, which the bees preferred. The logs were hollowed and sealed on both ends with ceramic or stone discs, one of which could be removed to access the honey. These hives weren't piled into fields, but instead placed horizontally along low platforms, near homes, or even within temples. A single household might maintain dozens of these logs. Beekeeping was not a business, but a deeply integrated part of domestic and spiritual life. Unlike the more aggressive Apis mellifera, the stingless Melipona beechi needed no smoke to calm them. They rarely strayed far from their hives. Their docility made them ideal for keeping near children, elders, or shrines. And the hive's horizontal shape meant that honey collecting was an exercise in moderation. One did not take everything, only a portion, always leaving enough for the bees to recover and thrive. Honeypot honey, the Maya's sacred sweetness. The honey itself had a thin, almost watery consistency, far different from the thick amber we recognize. It tasted of citrus, herbs, and wood, but to the Maya it was not merely sustenance. It was sacred. Honey was offered to gods and spirits, particularly during rituals tied to fertility, rain, and healing. The bee was seen as a messenger between worlds. In some texts and murals, they are depicted as intermediaries, carrying prayers or souls. One of the most remarkable uses of the honey was in Maya medicine. Combined with herbs or tree resins, it treated eye infections, burns, and gastrointestinal illnesses. The Maya physicians, or Amen, would mix this honey with ground bark or limestone powder for wound healing. And because it came from a bee so revered, the honey carried a weight beyond its sweetness. Consuming it was not just eating, it was communing. In ceremonies, honey was sometimes poured over idols or mixed with bauche, a mildly intoxicating drink made from fermented tree bark. These rituals took place in the same calm, low-lit rooms where elders taught stories by firelight and where children listened to the tales of the underworld. The beekeeper, a quiet role of honor. In Maya society, the beekeeper or kolokab was not just a farmer. They were often spiritual caretakers, responsible not only for the health of the bees but for the balance of nature itself. Knowledge of hive placement, bee behavior, and honey cycles was passed down generationally. These beekeepers kept detailed oral records: how long a log should rest after being carved, how many days after the first rains the bees would begin to swarm, and when to expect the best honey. They often observed bees in silence, learning not through force but through respect. It was not uncommon for a beekeeper to spend hours sitting near a hive, listening, smelling the air, noting which flowers were blooming. This slow, deliberate observation was the core of Maya survival, knowing the land so well that it became an extension of memory. Women were frequently involved in the care of bees and processing of honey, especially in regions closer to the coasts. Children, too, learned early, sometimes given tiny clay models of hives to play with, training their attention and patience. The role of beekeeper wasn't loud or heroic, but it was quietly vital. Cloud seasonal challenges and the ritual calendar. The Yucatan Peninsula's climate is defined by wet and dry seasons, and the stingless bees' activity responded accordingly. A good rainy season might mean abundant nectar. A dry year could starve entire hives. The Maya kept a ritual calendar not just for agriculture but also for the bees. Days were marked for cleaning hives, days for thanking the bees, and days to do nothing at all, to simply let the hives hum. Each activity was tied to the larger Tzolk'in and Hob calendars, aligning human behavior with the cosmos. Bees were seen as part of this celestial order, their silence and order a reflection of harmony. Collapse, ruins, and the quiet persistence. When Spanish forces began their conquest in the early 16th century, they noted the presence of bee logs and the strange behavior of these quiet insects. Some conquistadors admired the honey, others dismissed it. But by the 17th century, European bees had been introduced, and with them came new styles of agriculture, colonial pressures, and Christian rituals that pushed indigenous traditions to the periphery. Many log hives were destroyed, their keepers persecuted or silenced, but the bees did not disappear entirely. To this day, in rural corners of Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala, some families still keep melipona beechi. They maintain logs passed down from their grandparents, speak the old words of thanks to the bees, and observe the cycles of rain and flower as quietly as their ancestors once did. Unresolved thought. How did the Maya come to so gently entangle their lives with such a quiet insect? And what does this tell us about the unseen layers of survival, reverence, and community in a civilization often remembered only for its temples and tombs? You sit again near the low log hive, the same jaban whose ceramic plug was gently removed days before. The honey scent still lingers on your fingertips, thin and floral. But today's focus is not the bees alone. Today, your attention shifts outward from the hive to the world beyond it, from the quiet act of beekeeping to the intricate web it connected. For while the stingless bee may seem like a minor player in the grand theater of ancient Mesoamerican civilization, it played a critical role not just in local life, but in a vast and surprisingly complex economy and spiritual system. The bee, humble and unassuming, existed at the crossroads of trade, ritual, and environmental stewardship. And to understand this, we must first travel the forest trails and dusty roads that once hummed with silent exchange, not unlike the low buzz of the melipona bee itself. The honey routes trade across the Maya lowlands. The Maya were not a single empire, but a patchwork of city-states, each with its own rulers, markets, and alliances. Trade among them was essential not only for survival but for status and diplomacy. Melipona honey was one such trade item. It was packed into carefully sealed ceramic vessels and transported in bundles by taming human porters who carried loads for miles, often along limestone causeways known as sakbiob. The honey traveled from small forest villages into large ceremonial centers like Uxmal, Kaba, or Tikal. In these urban spaces, it might be exchanged for obsidian, cacao, or cotton textiles. Unlike salt or jade, honey didn't glitter, but its value was widely understood. Priests wanted it for rituals. Healers needed it for medicine. Nobles craved it for feasts. Even in death, some Maya elites were buried with small pots of honey meant to accompany them into the underworld. But this trade network carried more than jars and goods. It transported ideas, language, and stories, many of which revolved around the bees themselves. Open book: The Mythology of Melipona, Bees in Maya Cosmology. To the ancient Maya, all creatures were part of a cosmic hierarchy, each linked to the divine and to the cyclical passage of time. The stingless bee, small and unassuming, had an oversized role in these beliefs. In the Chilambalam, a post-conquest collection of Maya knowledge written in the Latin alphabet but in the Yucatec Maya language, bees are mentioned in prayers and almanacs. The Amusin Cab was believed to be the god of bees, often portrayed as a deity with black wings and honey dripping from his hands. He was invoked in times of hive sickness or drought, and was thought to travel between the earthly world and the Xibalba, the underworld. One story tells of how the bees were born from the breath of the maize god, their honey as sweet and necessary as the corn that fed the people. In some regions, bees were believed to be reborn ancestors visiting their descendants, keeping watch, and maintaining the delicate balance of life. The act of beekeeping was thus never just agricultural, it was ceremonial. When honey was extracted, it was not simply taken, it was negotiated. Beekeepers offered prayers, songs, and even bloodletting as thanks. The bees were addressed respectfully, often as little mothers or ladies, a linguistic habit that hints at deeper beliefs about their intelligence and power. Brain intelligence, memory, and bee behavior. What did the Maya know about bee biology? Perhaps not in the terms of modern science, but they were astute observers. They noticed that melipona bees favored specific trees and flowers. They knew the bees returned to the same spots again and again, suggesting memory. Some elders noted how a hive would mourn a lost queen, its activity reduced for days. There are even whispered reports, centuries old, of bees refusing to produce after a disrespectful keeper had disturbed the hive. Melipona bees don't sting, but they can bite. Yet even this rarely happened to experienced coal cab. The calmness of the bees was seen as a mirror of their caretaker's spirit. If the keeper was anxious, greedy, or loud, the bees would become restless. A peaceful keeper, on the other hand, would find the hive to be cooperative, almost generous. There's evidence that Maya beekeepers rotated hive logs based on sun patterns, or added small incisions to encourage new queens. In short, their understanding, though not codified in writing, was rich and remarkably accurate. Honeybee symbiosis and ecology, protecting the bees' world. It is easy to think of beekeeping as something humans do to animals, but in the Maya world, it was something humans did with animals. To maintain healthy hives, a community had to maintain healthy forests. The Dzilche tree, favored for hive logs and nectar, had to be protected. Pesticides and monocultures were unknown. Instead, the Maya practiced a form of milpa agriculture, rotating crops and allowing forests to regenerate. They maintained wildflower zones and avoided overharvesting. The bees benefited, so did the humans. There's archaeological evidence suggesting that during some city expansions, such as the growth of calicmol areas of forest, were intentionally left untouched to serve as pollinator reserves. This was not a formal bee sanctuary in the modern sense, but a quietly strategic move born of generations of observation. Even in times of drought or political unrest, the hives remained. They were a source of continuity, a thread of life that persisted when palaces fell and kings died. Church colonial interruption, disruption, and persistence. With the arrival of the Spanish came vast changes. Catholic missionaries disapproved of rituals involving honey. Beekeeping knowledge was seen as pagan. European Apis mellifera bees were introduced, more aggressive, but more productive. The native melipona was gradually pushed aside. Worse, the forests that sustained the hives were cleared. Sugarcane, cattle, and timber extraction changed the landscape. Log hives were sometimes burned as part of forced Christian conversion campaigns. But not all was lost. In the 18th century, colonial reports still mentioned Indios with strange beehives, and in isolated communities, the knowledge quietly continued. Women preserved the prayers. Children were still taught how to cut and dry a log, and the bees, though fewer, survived. In fact, the stingless bee became a kind of symbol not of resistance, necessarily, but of quiet continuation. It hummed beneath the surface of history, not unlike the slow melodies passed from grandmother to granddaughter under a canopy of stars. Modern echoes, reviving ancient practices. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a renewed interest in meliponiculture, the keeping of stingless bees, has taken root. Scientists study their social behavior. Environmentalists praise their importance to native plants. And Maya descendants, especially in the Yucatan, are reclaiming their ancestral practices. Workshops teach traditional hive construction. Ceremonies have returned, albeit quietly. NGOs and local leaders support the planting of native trees to support pollinators. And perhaps most significantly, young people are once again learning the old prayers, the rhythms of the hive, and the respectful patience that their ancestors practiced for centuries. Unresolved thought. If a civilization's wisdom can be measured not by its conquests, but by its care for small, silent creatures, what might the stingless bees of the Maya still have to teach us about balance, patience, and the resilience of memory? As you walk through the shaded paths of a modern Yucatan village, you might pass concrete houses and the quiet flicker of satellite dishes. But occasionally, tucked behind a fence or nestled between trees, you'll still find them, rows of old logs set gently on stone bases. They're not obvious. There's no buzzing chaos or swirling clouds, just a subtle hum, a stillness even. These are jawbones. They are ancient and alive. The story of the Melipona beachy, like the Maya people themselves, is not one of triumph in the traditional sense. It is not marked by conquest or technological explosion. Instead, it is a story of continuity, of subtle forms of resilience that defy erasure. To understand the full arc of this story, we must look at what has endured, how it has evolved, and what it still offers to those willing to slow down long enough to notice. The science of stingless bees, ancient wisdom, modern insight. Modern science has caught up in some ways with what Maya beekeepers always knew. Melipona beachy bees form complex social systems. Their colonies are built with layers of wax pots, some for brood, others for pollen, and still others for honey. Unlike European bees, their hives are not sharply geometric. They seem chaotic at first glance, organic, rounded, imprecise, but they're highly functional. The honey has been found to contain antimicrobial and antifungal properties. Studies in pharmacology suggest it may aid in wound healing and eye health, corroborating centuries of Maya medical use. It also contains higher moisture and acidity levels than Apis mellifera honey, giving it a distinct taste and biological profile. But it's not just the product that fascinates scientists. The behavior of the bees themselves has sparked new questions about navigation, group decision-making, and memory. Melipona bees can recognize individual humans. They remember locations for weeks, and they can adapt their behavior based on subtle environmental shifts, rain patterns, moonlight, wind. It turns out the ancient Maya were keeping one of the most sophisticated species of insect on Earth, and doing so not with control, but with cooperation. Revival movements and the cultural renaissance. In the early 2000s, efforts to preserve traditional meliponiculture gained traction across parts of Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala. Anthropologists, entomologists, and indigenous rights activists began working together, not just to protect the bees, but to protect the knowledge systems around them. Local cooperatives began forming groups of Maya farmers and elders, reviving beekeeping rituals, rebuilding traditional hives, and sharing knowledge across generations. Some of these cooperatives now export stingless bee honey, not in large industrial quantities, but as a cultural product bottled with care, labeled in both Spanish and Yucatec Maya. Workshops are offered in rural schools. Grandparents sit with children, teaching the songs once whispered to the bees. In some places, festivals have returned celebrations where hives are blessed, and dances reenact the ancient stories of bee gods and maize. This isn't nostalgia, it's resistance by way of continuity. And it's spreading. Across Latin America, stingless beekeeping is re-emerging as an ecologically sound practice with ancient roots. In Brazil, Bolivia, and Peru, similar practices are being rediscovered and revalued. But the Maya, with their deeply embedded spiritual, ecological, and linguistic relationship to the melipona bee, remain at the heart of the revival. Old woman voices from the hive, oral history and the female line. Many of the keepers of this knowledge are women. While male beekeepers, Kolo Cab, were often the public face of beekeeping in the past, much of the daily practice, especially during colonial suppression, fell to women. They kept small hives behind homes, tended to them while grinding maize or feeding children. It was a quiet care, passed from mother to daughter. A women's science, hidden in plain sight. In interviews conducted with elder women in rural Campeche and Quintana Roo, a recurring theme emerges: reverence. These women speak of the bees not as tools or pets but as relatives. They refer to individual hives by nickname. They talk to the bees, ask permission before opening a hive. They describe dreams where the bees offer warnings of illness, storms, or even family trouble. Whether or not such dreams are true in a scientific sense is irrelevant. What matters is that this relationship, the human-bee bond, has persisted. It's not metaphor, it's mutualism. And it reflects a different way of being in the world, one that values slowness, attention, and interdependence. Globe showing Europe, Africa modern threats, tourism, climate, and global change. Despite the revival, all is not calm. Deforestation, pesticide use, and urban expansion continue to threaten the bees' habitat. Logging of native trees like the Dzilche reduces both nesting sites and nectar sources. Climate change has shifted blooming patterns and increased hive mortality. Tourism, too, is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brings visibility and revenue. Some ecolodges now include melipona beekeeping tour. Guests can see ancient hives, taste the honey, and listen to Maya guides describe the traditions. This can be empowering for communities. But it can also lead to commodification. The ritual becomes performance. The hive becomes an exhibit. And still the bees hum, calm, persistent. They do not resist violently. They simply adapt, slow their rhythm, move to quieter corners. In this, they mirror the people who have kept them alive for millennia. Honeybee Reflections: what the calm bee offers the noisy world. In a world increasingly driven by urgency, by speed, productivity, and disruption, the story of the Maya stingless bee offers a rare counterpoint. Here is a species that thrives on calm, that does not sting or scream, that produces slowly, that builds soft, circular architecture, that survives not through aggression but through adaptation and alliance. And here is a culture often misunderstood, reduced to pyramids and calendars, that embedded this calmness into daily life, that made space for bees in the household, that sang to them, that shaped economies and rituals around their quiet labor. What would it mean to see this not as a curiosity, but as a model? In an age of environmental crisis, the melipona bee teaches us to listen before acting, to observe before extracting, and to honor before taking. Its keepers past and present remind us that true resilience is not always visible. It hums beneath the surface, in logs, in stories, in silence. Final reflection: if history belongs to the loud, the conquerors, the builders, the warriors, then perhaps wisdom belongs to the quiet. And in the nearly silent flight of the stingless bee, we find not just an echo of the past, but a path forward. One shaped not by domination, but by patience, ritual, and care. Story 2. Thread by thread, the slow rise of medieval linen production. The day begins quietly in a damp, low-lying field somewhere in Flanders. The mist clings to everything: the soil, the stalks, the low thatched roofs in the distance. You walk slowly between long rows of greenish-blue plants with slender stems, barely knee-high. These are flax plants. Nothing about them seems remarkable. They are neither fragrant nor imposing. And yet, these delicate stalks are at the center of one of the most labor-intensive, time-consuming, and quietly revolutionary processes in medieval European life: the making of linen. Long before cotton came to dominate wardrobes and well before wool was refined into the high cloth of guilds, linen reigned as the material of the ordinary. It clothed peasants and nobles alike: undergarments, tablecloths, priestly vestments, and bandages. Linen was everywhere, though it almost never spoke its name. It was the base layer, the foundational fabric, the hidden thread upon which European life quietly unfolded. But linen was not easy. To produce even a single shirt of decent quality might take half a year of preparation, dozens of steps, and countless hands. And it all started humbly with the planting of flax seeds. Seedling flax, a difficult and demanding crop. Flax, Linum usitatissimum, is one of humanity's oldest cultivated plants. The species name literally means most useful, and yet it is finicky. It requires well-drained, loamy soil, not too acidic, not too rich. It hates weeds. It cannot tolerate drought, yet despises soggy roots. It must be sown in spring, timed carefully between the last frost and the first rush of growth. Medieval farmers lacking modern forecasting relied on folk wisdom, the moon, the feel of the earth in their hands. Sowing flax was not a haphazard act. Seeds had to be evenly distributed, spaced for straight growth. The straighter the stalk, the longer the fibers and the better the linen. Bending or branching would weaken the threads. The crop had to be pampered, but not too much. A careless hoe or impatient hand could ruin the year's yield. And all of this for a plant that grew barely 2 feet tall and flowered only briefly, with pale blue petals that lasted mere hours before falling. But the yield, inside the stalks, hidden beneath woody husks, were the bast fibers: long, flexible strands that, once processed, would become linen. Basket harvesting, from green stalk to golden fiber. Unlike many crops, flax could not be cut. It had to be pulled, root and all, by hand. Cutting damaged the internal fibers. And so, at harvest time, entire communities gathered in the fields, yanking the stalks from the ground, shaking loose the soil, and bundling them into sheaves. It was tiring work. Knees ached, hands blistered, the smell of soil hung in the air, but the job was far from over. The flax bundles were then left to dry in the sun for a few days, just enough to lose their moisture, not enough to go brittle. Timing mattered at every stage. Next came retting, a process that sounds simple: rotting the stalks, but was anything but. The goal was to separate the outer woody parts from the inner fibers by controlled microbial decay. Retting could be done in various ways: in standing water, pond retting; in streams, flax pools; or simply on the ground with dew retting. Each method had trade-offs. Water retting was faster but risked over-rotting. Dew retting was safer but could take weeks. The smell was infamous: a thick, sour stench that hung in the air for days. Yet experienced workers could identify the exact moment when the stalks were ready by the way they snapped under pressure or the color of their stems. Mistakes were expensive. Underripe stalks produced coarse fibers. Over-retted flax became mush. Once retted, the bundles were dried again, stacked carefully, turned often, kept out of the rain. Then came breaking, where the brittle stalks were crushed to release the inner fibers. This was done with a wooden brake, a sort of hinged lever that cracked the stalks without cutting the fibers. The rhythmic thumping of brakes was a common sound in flax-producing villages. Next, the material was scutched, a process of scraping away the woody chaff with wooden blades. Then heckled, or combed, through progressively finer iron combs to straighten and separate the long fibers from the short, coarse ones. All of this just to create rough bundles of raw linen fiber. And only now could spinning begin. Yarn spinning and the women of the whorl. Spinning flax into thread was overwhelmingly the work of women. It was slow, delicate, and required constant attention. Unlike wool, flax fibers are long and stiff. They need to be moistened continuously during spinning to reduce breakage. Medieval spinners often kept a small bowl of water nearby or even used their lips to wet the thread. Spinning wheels were rare until the later Middle Ages. Most flax was spun on the drop spindle. The term spinster wasn't just a descriptor, it was an economic identity. In village records and guild rolls, unmarried women often listed their trade simply as spinner. They worked alone, in groups, while walking or during long evenings by firelight. Their thread became the foundation of the local economy. A good spinner was highly valued, her fingers quick and steady, her attention never wavering. And yet her work was largely invisible. Thread weaving, bleaching, and the hidden labor of linen. Once spun, the flax thread went to the weavers, often male in later medieval Europe, organized into guilds, especially in towns like Bruges, Ghent, or Arras. Weaving linen was challenging. The thread was less elastic than wool, more prone to breakage. Warping a loom took hours. The fabric came off stiff, grayish, full of dust from processing. It had to be washed, pounded, and bleached, often by laying it on grass in the sun, sometimes for weeks. There were no chemicals to accelerate the process, just time, patience, and light. A finished piece of linen cloth might pass through 10 or more hands. Every yard carried the memory of hundreds of hours of field work, soaking, scraping, spinning, and weaving, all for something that in the end would line a drawer or be worn beneath armor, never seen. Yet linen was central to life. It wrapped the newborn, covered the dining table, lined coffins, shrouded saints. It was soft against the skin and tough in labor. A peasant's shirt could last for years, patched, re-dyed, handed down. A fabric that recorded nothing and everything. Linen has another peculiarity. It rarely absorbs dye. Most medieval linen was undyed or bleached to a pale off-white. This gave it a visual quietness, a fabric that didn't shout, that blended into background. But for all its silence, linen was everywhere, and it endured. Some pieces have survived for centuries, used in bookbindings, priestly robes, even mummified wrappings. Unlike wool, which decays, linen resists time. Its threads whisper across the centuries. And yet it recorded almost nothing. No names, no maker's marks, no initials embroidered in thread. It was anonymous labor, invisible work, and still it held the shape of life itself. Unresolved thought. How much of history is built upon the backs of fibers slowly pulled, rotted, scraped, and spun by hands we'll never know? And how many of those hands shaped the world not through war or wealth, but through the persistent care of making something soft, plain, and essential? You wake again to a soft scratching sound, no longer the wind through flax fields, but the slow clack of wooden shutters opening onto a cobbled street. The air smells faintly of ash and tallow. It's market day in a small Flemish town. Traders arrive before dawn, carts rumbling in from countryside villages, sacks of thread and bolts of rough-spun linen stacked neatly behind them. Nothing about this day is loud. Nothing is extravagant. But everything is precise, quiet transactions of a quiet fabric, deeply woven into the economy of medieval Europe. Linen was more than clothing. It was currency, a symbol of piety, industry, and respectability. It padded armor and covered saints. It fueled trade and paid taxes. And though often overlooked in grand histories of kings and crusades, linen helped build Europe from the inside out, thread by thread. Linen and the monasteries, cloistered production lines. Monasteries across medieval Europe were among the largest producers and consumers of linen. From the 9th century onward, religious communities developed sprawling internal economies, gardens, tanneries, vineyards, scriptoriums, and among these, flax plots and weaving rooms. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized labor as a form of devotion. Linen production, humble and repetitive, was ideal. Monks and nuns wore habits lined with linen, slept on linen sheets, used linen bandages in infirmaries, and wrapped relics in the finest bleached cloth. Women's convents, in particular, became renowned for their weaving. Records from the Abbey of Fontevraud describe strict schedules for spinning and communal wefting, with penalties for broken threads or irregular stitching. Beyond internal use, surplus linen was sold at local markets to support the monastery's needs. Some monasteries operated like businesses, maintaining relationships with rural flax growers and managing linen exports to neighboring towns. In this way, linen production became part of a broader system: monks praying over hives of beeswax candles, nuns spinning thread in silence, lay brothers hauling bundles of redded flax across courtyards. All of it was quiet, all of it essential. Domestic work and the shadow economy of women. While monasteries institutionalized linen production, most of it still happened in homes. For peasant families, especially in Northern Europe, flax was a lifeline crop, less perishable than food, more valuable than wool, and it was largely managed by women. A woman might grow a small flax patch in the corner of her garden, red it in a nearby stream, dry it on the roof, and spin it through the winter. She would produce thread, weave narrow strips, patch clothes, and set aside lengths of linen as part of her daughter's marriage portion. In many towns, women formed informal cooperative groups, pooling flax or trading spun thread for help with weaving. Some worked under the putting-out system, where merchants supplied raw flax and collected the finished cloth for resale. Linen allowed women to earn in a world that rarely gave them formal access to guilds or property. It was never glamorous, but it was empowering. Local court records are filled with minor disputes over thread weights, missed deliveries, or damaged cloth, evidence of how serious and how common this home-based work was. These stories rarely made it into chronicles or charters, yet they represent the bulk of economic activity in many medieval communities. Barber pole textiles and status: what linen meant to the body. Despite its reputation as a plain, even dull fabric, linen held powerful social meaning. In medieval iconography, white linen symbolized purity. Saints, virgins, angels, all clothed in soft folds of bleached linen. In churches, linen cloths covered altars and swaddled sacred vessels. In death, linen wrapped corpses for burial, offering the body a last dignity. Even among the wealthy, linen mattered. It formed the base layer beneath silks and brocades. Wealthy women wore chemises of the softest flax, embroidered with personal symbols. Nobles packed linen napkins and handkerchiefs in travel trunks. Kings' household accounts included line items for fine cloth, for undergarments linen, not wool. It was also linked to health. Physicians recommended linen over wool for bandaging wounds. Surgeons carried strips of clean linen for emergencies. In some regions, laws required bakers to cover bread with linen instead of wool to prevent contamination. Clean, plain, practical. Linen was the fabric of civilization. Luggage linen in trade and taxation. By the 13th century, linen had become a major trade commodity, especially in regions like Flanders, Normandy, and parts of southern Germany. Towns like Ypres, Arras, and Ghent emerged as textile hubs, with linen exports reaching England, Italy, and the Baltic. These towns had powerful linen guilds, controlling quality, enforcing regulations, and setting prices. To be a guild master weaver, one had to produce a flawless piece of linen as a masterwork. Inspectors examined it for consistency, tension, and dye quality, if dyed. Penalties for poor work included fines, public shamming, and in rare cases, loss of guild membership. The linen trade fueled urban economies. Taxes were levied on raw flax, spun thread, and finished cloth. Linen was used to pay rents in rural areas and offer tithes to churches. In some cities, new citizens were required to swear their oaths while standing on a linen-covered stool, a symbolic gesture of honesty and purity. By the 14th century, inventories from merchant households listed dozens of linen items: tablecloths, sheets, towels, nightgowns. Even the humble dish rag was a recorded item of value. The demand never waned. Linen became not only a trade good but a unit of economic measurement. To own linen was to have standing. Laws, labels, and the rise of regulation. As linen became more widespread, so did attempts to control it. Sumptuary laws across Europe tried to regulate who could wear what. In 14th century England, laws forbade peasants from wearing dyed or embroidered linen. In parts of France, only certain classes could wear bleached linen tunics. Quality control also emerged. In 15th century Germany, weavers were required to stamp finished bolts with identifying marks, precursors to brand labels. These cloth marks allowed buyers to trace cloth back to specific workshops and guaranteed a certain standard. Punishments for forged marks were severe. A single warped thread could cost a weaver their livelihood. The stakes were high, even for something so boring as cloth. And yet, these laws and marks speak to linen's importance as an economic driver, a symbol of trust, and a medium of record. Unresolved thought. If we judged history not by monuments or battles but by the quiet materials that touched every life, would we find that the real foundations of society were spun not in palaces, but in cottage yards, behind monastery walls, and in the slow, rhythmic twist of thread around a spinner's fingers? You find yourself now in a room of soft light and quiet movement. A high window lets in the late afternoon sun. Dust floats in the air, caught in golden shafts. A woman sits on a low stool, steadily darning a thin strip of worn linen, her needle rising and falling like a heartbeat. This could be any century. Even as empires fall and borders shift, the work continues. The humble rhythms of flax and fiber persist. Linen, once pulled from damp fields and retted in putrid ponds, lives on not only in the cloth itself, but in the habits it created, the labor it demanded, and the social structures it quietly shaped. This final section traces the long afterlife of linen, through changing fashions, industrial revolutions, and the slow retreat of the hand loom. It is the story of how a fabric born in obscurity became a mirror of human endurance, resilient, overlooked, but always present. Generations of care, inheriting linen, inheriting labor. In the pre-modern household, linen was rarely discarded. It was too precious, too slow to make. Instead, it was inherited, reused, and repurposed. A peasant family might pass down a single linen sheet through 3 generations. Tablecloths became curtains. Curtains became towels. Towels became bandages or baby swaddles. Finally, when even rags were worn through, they were gathered and sold to papermakers, an industry that relied heavily on linen scraps for centuries before wood pulp was used. Wills often mention linen explicitly. To my daughter Marjorie, I leave 2 fine linen shifts and a tablecloth not stained. English peasant Will, 1478. This wasn't sentimentality. It was economy. But there was a tenderness, too, something intimate in giving a child the fabric that had warmed your body or dried your hands. Something that reminded each generation of the labor behind each thread. Even the word linens survived in language long after the material faded in use. To this day, we say bed linens, table linens, even though they may be cotton or synthetic. The word became shorthand for domestic continuity. Factory, the machine age. Linen meets industrialization. By the 18th century, The rise of industrialization changed everything. Cotton, driven by transatlantic plantations and colonial expansion, began to replace linen as the most common textile. Easier to dye, softer to the touch, and less labor-intensive to process, cotton flooded the European market. Linen, slow to grow and difficult to produce, could not keep up. Still, in certain regions, especially in Ireland, Belgium, and parts of Scandinavia, linen clung on. Its quality was unmatched for certain uses: sails, bookbindings, lace, napery, and high-end garments. Factories adapted. Mechanized flax breaks and spinning frames were introduced. Flax processing mills began to appear along rivers. But even with machinery, the production remained challenging. Redding, in particular, resisted mechanization. Many traditional steps had to remain manual well into the 19th century. As urban centers grew, rural flax farming declined. Younger generations abandoned spinning and weaving in favor of factory jobs. The old rhythms began to fade. But linen didn't disappear. Instead, it became specialized. It left the world of the everyday and entered a new realm: luxury, heritage, and craft. Books, paper, pages, and the literary afterlife of linen. In one of history's quiet ironies, linen, so often used to wrap the body, also became the medium for wrapping the mind. From the 13th through 18th centuries, most European paper was made from recycled linen rags. The invention of the printing press and the rise of literacy depended on the lowly cloths discarded by housewives, monks, and tailors. When you hold an early printed book or a parchment scroll, you are likely touching the ghost of someone's shirt, towel, or bandage. The ragpickers of early modern Europe gathered worn linen, which was soaked, pounded into pulp, and pressed into sheets. The Gutenberg Bible, made from linen. The U.S. Declaration of Independence, drafted on linen rag paper. Letters from lovers, edicts from kings, sermons from pulpits, all pressed into fibers born in flax fields. Thus, linen outlived its function. It became memory itself. Thread preservation, revival, and the return to craft. In the 20th and 21st centuries, a quiet resurgence of interest in linen has emerged. Sustainable fashion movements prize flax for its minimal environmental impact. Unlike cotton, flax requires no irrigation and fewer chemicals. Heritage weavers in Belgium, Ireland, and Eastern Europe continue to produce high-quality linen using traditional methods. Some even use hand looms, reviving practices lost for centuries. Artisans craft hand-stitched garments, table linens, and lace that harken back to medieval designs. Museums preserve flax breaks, spindles, and heckling combs. Workshops teach spinning and scutching. Tourists walk through recreated flax fields, watching women in linen aprons harvest stalks by hand. And in quiet corners of old homes, grandmothers still open cedar chests and unfold linen sheets yellowed with age, but intact. The labor remains embedded in each thread. Magnifying glass tilted left the philosophy of the fiber, lessons in slowness. More than just a fabric, linen is a philosophy. It teaches slowness, precision, and cooperation with nature. Each step demands patience. You cannot rush flax to grow. You cannot force retting. You cannot machine away care. Linen, like history itself, resists shortcuts. It asks you to pay attention, to wait, to respect the unseen work of many hands. It does not glitter. It does not shout. But it endures. Final reflection. If you trace the arc of linen from damp medieval fields to luxury boutiques, from nuns' habits to book pages, you find not a story of triumph or fame, but one of continuity. A fabric spun from humility, sustained by care, and preserved by memory. The thread runs quiet but long. Story 3. The Mud Brick Empire, housing and heat in ancient Mesopotamia. The sun rises low over the plains of the Tigris-Euphrates basin. The air is dry and already heavy with heat, though it is only morning. In the distance, Reeds whisper near the banks, and behind them, modest homes square, flat-roofed, and the color of dust blend into the landscape. These are the houses of ancient Mesopotamia, and they are built not of stone or wood, but of mud. There are no ornate columns here, no sweeping arches or tiled roofs. Yet this land, where the rivers run slow and wide, is considered the cradle of civilization. The earliest cities Uruk, Eridu, Nippur rose from this very soil, and they rose on the backs of a building material as plain and perishable as the earth itself, the sun-dried mud brick. For thousands of years, entire societies built their lives quite literally out of the ground beneath them. The story of Mesopotamian housing is not one of luxury, but of necessity, invention, and the human capacity to make permanence from impermanence. The mud brick, the foundation of daily life. The Mesopotamians used a building method so simple it seems almost too mundane to examine. Yet it is this very simplicity that allowed cities to grow. Mud brick, also called adobe, was made from local clay mixed with straw, chaff, or animal dung. The ingredients were stomped together by foot in large shallow pits until the consistency was thick and malleable. The mixture was then packed into rectangular wooden molds and left in the sun to dry for days. No kilns, no glazes, just earth, water, fiber, and solar heat. This basic brick was light, insulating, and easy to replace, but it was also fragile, eroded by rain, crumbled by time. A wall needed constant care. A roof often sagged. Yet for the Mesopotamians, this was not a flaw. It was part of the rhythm of maintenance that defined much of their lives. Every few years, houses were repaired or expanded. Layers were added. Roof beams were replaced. And as homes decayed, they were flattened and new ones built atop the old. Over time, these layers of mud created artificial mounds that preserved entire cities beneath them. The shape of a home, domestic architecture. Most Mesopotamian homes were one- or two-room structures with flat roofs and few external windows. Privacy was key, and rooms were organized around a central courtyard that provided air, light, and a protected space for cooking or resting. Walls were thick, which kept the heat out during scorching summers and retained warmth during cool nights. The floors were also made of packed clay, sometimes covered with mats woven from reeds. Roofs were made of palm trunks or wooden beams, covered in more layers of mud and straw. Inside, the home was plain. Storage jars lined the walls. Raised platforms served as both seating and sleeping areas. Cooking took place in clay ovens or open hearths set into the floor. Furniture was minimal. Most of life happened at low levels, sitting, squatting, reclining. There was no sharp divide between work and rest, sacred and secular. Daily life blended into the structure itself. And the house was not only a shelter, it was cosmic. The ancient Mesopotamians believed their homes mirrored the divine architecture of the universe. The central courtyard represented order, an echo of the temple layout, which itself reflected the structure of the heavens. Fire, managing heat, cooling without tools. Mesopotamia's climate was extreme. Summers were long and dry, with temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees C, 104 degrees F. Winters were short but could be surprisingly cold. To manage this, builders relied on passive thermal regulation. Thick walls absorbed heat slowly and released it at night. High ceilings allowed hot air to rise away from occupants. Courtyards promoted airflow and cooled spaces through evaporation. Roofs were used at night as sleeping platforms, especially during summer. Families would carry bedding to the roof in the evening and return inside at dawn. No glass, no chimneys, no fans, just carefully structured space and thousands of years of observation. In larger homes or palaces, walls might be whitewashed to reflect sunlight. Clay pipes and drain channels helped move water, keeping floors clean and sometimes cool. But even in the grandest buildings, the materials remained the same: mud, straw, reed, and water. Bricks decay and renewal, living with impermanence. Mud brick decays quickly when exposed to moisture. Rain could erode an entire wall if left unchecked. As a result, homes required regular plastering and patching, often before each rainy season. This work was done by the inhabitants themselves. There were no large-scale renovation crews, just families maintaining their shelters year by year, season by season. The process became almost ritualized, repairing, rebuilding, reshaping. But there was a benefit to this fragility. Because homes were easy to dismantle, cities could adapt to shifting needs. Neighborhoods could be reconfigured. Rooms could be added for growing families. Houses could even be partially demolished and reused. Bricks from old walls were rehydrated and repacked into new ones. This idea of impermanence as strength is central to Mesopotamian architecture. Buildings were not static, they were living systems. The builders, labor, and community. Who built these homes? Not kings or priests, but ordinary people. In the absence of complex tools or heavy machinery, construction was community-driven. Neighbors helped neighbors. Families worked together. Labor was seasonal, tied to the rhythms of agriculture. When fields required less attention, homes were repaired. The skills needed were passed down informally through practice, not parchment. Children learned by watching. Adults learned by doing. There were professional builders for temples or palaces, but domestic architecture remained mostly a local knowledge economy. This distributed labor model created tight-knit communities, where survival depended not just on individual effort, but collective maintenance. The quiet rhythm of domestic construction in ancient Mesopotamia was just one layer of a much larger architectural landscape. Beyond the humble courtyard houses of farmers and traders rose the defining features of the ancient city. Temples, palaces, granaries, walls, and ziggurats, all built with the same fragile, sun-dried bricks. To walk through a Mesopotamian city was not to experience monumentality in the way we imagine Greek columns or Roman aqueducts. Instead, it was to witness a society that built big with soft materials, one layer at a time. Their scale was impressive, but more remarkable was the consistency with which they chose mud as the foundation of even their most sacred and powerful spaces. Let us now leave the home and walk into the public world, into the sacred precincts and administrative halls, where the same bricks told a different story. Temples of clay, ziggurats, and the divine connection. In Mesopotamia, the most important public building was the temple, known in Sumerian as Eakut House, and often as Eakut Gal, Great House. Each city had at least one main temple dedicated to its patron deity. These temples weren't merely places of worship. They were economic and political centers, part warehouse, part court, part ritual space. They held land, employed laborers, and even managed trade contracts. Priests administered much of daily life from these mud brick structures. The most iconic of Mesopotamian religious buildings was the ziggurat, a stepped tower thought to represent a bridge between earth and the heavens. The ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana, rose above the city in stacked platforms, each smaller than the one below. But again, these monumental buildings were not made of stone. The inner cores were built from sun-dried mud bricks, with fired bricks used only for facing and stairs where contact with the elements was most damaging. The decision wasn't one of limitation, it was one of pragmatism and tradition. Every ziggurat needed constant repair. Annual maintenance crews replaced weather-worn sections. Rainwater was carefully channeled away. Crumbling surfaces were refaced. These buildings were not frozen monuments, they were ongoing projects, always being tended. Temples rose like the homes around them, one humble brick at a time. Palaces, authority and earth-toned silence. Royal palaces were not always distinct from temples in function or construction. Kings governed from large mud brick compounds that included audience halls, treasury rooms, courtyards, and private quarters. Excavations at Mari, Nimrud, and Nineveh reveal palaces with hundreds of rooms, some decorated with colorful wall paintings and stone thresholds, but always relying on clay brick for the majority of the structure. At Mari, the palace of Zimri-Lim, a king from the 18th century BCE, included over 260 rooms, many adorned with plastered walls and religious murals. Yet the foundation mud brick, the floors baked earth or brick, the walls thick, simple, durable. Even at the height of royal grandeur, kings did not opt for marble or granite. They trusted in the material their people knew how to shape. Their greatness was declared not in opulent stonework, but in the scale and complexity of structures made from the most ordinary substance. Walls and granaries, collective strength in clay. City walls were also constructed of mud bricks. Some, like those of Uruk, stretched for kilometers, enclosing urban centers and controlling access. These defensive structures were periodically rebuilt and thickened, often becoming massive through generations of reinforcement. Granary storage buildings for grain, oil, and wool used similar designs. Because these stores supported both civic and temple economies, they needed to be cool, dry, and defensible. Mud brick, with its insulating properties, served all three goals. Massive clay bins, built right into the floors and walls of storage rooms, held the harvests. Their contents were carefully recorded using cuneiform tablets, many of which survived long after the buildings themselves eroded. And when structures failed, as they often did, new ones were built atop the old, layering city upon city in mounds we still uncover today. Inscriptions and royal bricks. Despite the humble material, Mesopotamian rulers took pride in their building projects, leaving their names inscribed on bricks for future generations. Many bricks recovered from temple ruins bear inscriptions like, "Brick of Enadam, king of Lagash, son of Akurgal, built the temple of Ningirsu." These were not decorative elements. They were declarations of continuity. By marking bricks, kings inserted themselves into the daily fabric of city life, making their authority literally part of the walls. Some royal projects included thousands of bricks with such inscriptions. They weren't visible to the eye once the building was complete, but they remained embedded in the architecture, a quiet assertion of legacy and power. This shows a unique relationship between power and material. Where other cultures built in marble to dazzle, Mesopotamian kings built in mud to endure, one cycle at a time. Temporary permanence, architecture as process. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Mesopotamian architecture is the idea of impermanence as permanence. Buildings did not last forever. The environment was harsh and the material degraded. Yet rather than resisting decay, the Mesopotamians incorporated it into their worldview. Temples were ritually rebuilt, not just repaired, but periodically torn down and reconstructed on the same sacred ground. This act was both practical and ceremonial, symbolizing renewal, reconnection with the divine, and respect for tradition. Palaces changed with new rulers. Homes were modified across generations. Even public buildings bore the marks of countless revisions. Architecture was not a finished product. It was a living expression of a society in motion, flexible, collaborative, rooted in material and memory. Final thought for Section 2. Why would a society capable of writing and record-keeping choose to build its most sacred and powerful structures from something that crumbles in rain? Could it be that permanence, in their world, was not found in stone, but in the act of rebuilding itself? Time passes differently when you build with mud. A few seasons of rain, a neglected roof, or the trampling of livestock can reduce even a proud home to an outline in the dirt. Walls crumble, roofs cave in, and slowly the space becomes something else: a garden, a stable, a memory. In this final section, We'll examine the endurance of mud brick cities not through their intact survival, but through their rediscovery. We'll explore how archaeologists painstakingly reassembled lives from clay and dust, how modern builders have returned to the wisdom of ancient methods, and how a civilization defined by ephemerality left behind one of the most durable cultural blueprints in human history. Mesopotamia's story is not one of monuments. It is a story of materials that return to Earth, of cultures that built cities again and again, and of ideas that remained even as bricks dissolved. Decay as design, cities that sank into time. Unlike stone cities that withstood the centuries through brute endurance, most Mesopotamian cities eroded gradually, layer by layer. And yet, their very impermanence preserved them. As mud brick buildings decayed, they formed Tell's artificial hills made of crushed bricks, ash, pottery shards, and accumulated dust. These mounds, scattered across modern-day Iraq, Syria, and southeastern Turkey, often contain hundreds of layers of human occupation. Each layer marks a moment of construction, collapse, and rebuilding, sometimes spanning millennia. Cities like Eridu, Nineveh, and Lagash became time-stacked settlements, their histories literally compressed beneath centuries of earth. These tells weren't mapped or excavated until the 19th century, when European travelers, soldiers, and early archaeologists began to take an interest in the ruined mounds dotting the desert. Rediscovery in dust, archaeology and the mud brick puzzle. Early excavators like Austin Henry Layard, Leonard Woolley, and Henry Rawlinson ventured into Mesopotamia with grand ambitions, but they were often surprised by the material reality of what they found. Rather than marble columns or golden tombs, they unearthed crumbled walls, soft foundations, and endless bricks. The structures were difficult to recognize, often appearing as blurred outlines of what had once been vibrant homes and temples. But hidden within those eroded layers were cuneiform tablets, clay seals, and preserved floor plans clues that slowly revealed how cities functioned, how homes were organized, and how people lived. At Woolley's excavation uncovered residential neighborhoods with multiple layers of occupation. He found houses with small courtyards, cooking areas, drainage channels, and household shrines. Some bricks still bore kingly inscriptions. Others had impressions of reed mats or children's footprints, the literal imprints of daily life. Even where the structures had vanished, the evidence of living remained. Modern lessons, earthen architecture today. In many ways, the story of mud brick didn't end with the fall of Sumer or the rise of Assyria. It continues today. Across the globe, from the Berber villages of Morocco to the adobe towns of the American Southwest, from the mountain homes of Yemen to rural parts of Iraq and Syria, earthen construction persists. In fact, over one-third of the world's population still lives in homes built from earth-based materials. These buildings are low-cost, sustainable, thermally efficient, and culturally resilient. In recent years, architects and engineers have revisited ancient techniques, applying them in modern contexts. Projects in disaster relief, refugee housing, and eco-architecture now look to mud brick not as primitive, but as adaptive technology. Some universities even offer courses in rammed earth and adobe engineering, pointing to Mesopotamian innovations as models for sustainable development. Thus, the legacy of these ancient builders lives on not as a curiosity, but as a solution. Ideas that endured, culture beyond the brick. Mesopotamia's architectural legacy is not just material. It is institutional, conceptual, and practical. This is the place where urban planning was born, cities laid out with purpose, zoning and infrastructure. Drainage systems and irrigation channels were integrated into homes and fields. Temples functioned as administrative hubs, blending religion, economy, and governance. Multi-room domestic dwellings featured airflow management, privacy zones, and storage solutions still recognizable today. The physical walls may be gone, but the patterns of life, social organization, and urban logic remain. In many modern Middle Eastern cities, the layout of old quarters' narrow alleys, central courtyards, shaded streets still echo Mesopotamian design principles. Their bricks dissolved, but their blueprints survived. The human scale of clay. What makes the story of Mesopotamian architecture so quietly powerful is its human scale. Unlike the awe-inspiring but impersonal monuments of later empires, these buildings were tactile, familiar, and in a constant state of care. They required you to know the seasons, to understand the behavior of water and sun, to work with neighbors, and to repair what was broken. In this way, every home was a living document, a record not just of occupation, but of participation. Even the palace, the temple, the wall, all were built by hands. Hands that mixed clay, that kneaded straw into paste, that laid bricks in the heat and returned to them after the rains. The cycle, erosion, memory, renewal. So much of Mesopotamian life was shaped by cycles. The flooding of rivers, the movement of stars, the turning of seasons, and the rebuilding of walls. This worldview infused their literature, their laws, their myths. The famous epic of Gilgamesh begins in a city of bricks. Enkidu is buried under a mound. The gods destroy with a flood. Kings inscribe their deeds in clay, and time always brings things back to earth. The cycle was never feared. It was accepted, even honored. Buildings were meant to return to dust, just as humans did, and in doing so, they nourished the ground for new lives. Final reflection. What does it mean that one of the world's first civilizations built its greatness from a substance meant to crumble? Perhaps it means that permanence is not about resisting change, but learning to build within it, and that even in a world made of mud, ideas can stand for thousands of years. Story 4. Counting peas, the bureaucrats of the Roman grain dole. The city of Rome was never silent. Its streets echoed with the clatter of sandals, the creak of carts, the cries of vendors, and the dull murmur of politics. But beneath the noise, there was another sound, a quieter one. The sound of record-keeping, of scrolls unrolling, of tallies marked in wax, and grains weighed in steady hands. It was the sound of the bureaucracy. Feeding a population of over 1 million people at its height, Rome needed more than military might or monumental architecture. It needed a system, a careful, grinding, repetitive system for making sure its citizens didn't starve. This system was the annona, the Roman grain dole. It was run not by generals or senators, but by clerks, scribes, weighers, inspectors, and overseers, men whose names rarely appear in marble, but whose work sustained the very foundation of the empire. This is the story of how peas, grain, oil, and paperwork kept Rome alive. It is a story of lists, tokens, silos, and schedules. A story of food not as luxury but as infrastructure. The problem of bread, feeding the eternal city. Rome in the 1st century BCE was bursting at the seams. It had grown from a compact hilltop village into a vast metropolis, pulling in migrants, freedmen, merchants, and ex-soldiers from across the empire. Many of these residents were urban poor citizens without land, income, or reliable work, and hungry populations are dangerous populations. By the time of Julius Caesar, the grain dole, originally offered as emergency aid, had become a regular public entitlement. Caesar reduced the number of eligible recipients to around 150,000 men, providing them with monthly rations of grain measured, distributed, and documented with extraordinary care. This was not generosity, it was policy. The annona was a tool of control, ensuring loyalty, stability, and a minimum standard of subsistence. And it required massive bureaucratic machinery. The fermentare, more than spies. The word fermentum meant grain, and those involved in the annona were part of an elaborate and changing network. At the top was the Prefectus Annani, an official appointed by the emperor to oversee all aspects of grain import, storage, and distribution. Below him were countless administrators, warehouse managers, harbor supervisors, bakers, and guards. Among them were the frumentarii, originally grain collectors and recorders. Though they later evolved into an intelligence service, their name reflects their original role, handling grain logistics. They worked with a vast infrastructure: warehouses horia to store imported grain, granaries in and around the city, mills and bakeries, often state-controlled or state-subsidized, ships bringing wheat from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. Every step required records, scrolls marked with symbols, tallies etched in lead, tokens handed to citizens for redemption. Bureaucracy was not decoration, it was survival. Weights, measures, and tokens. Imagine standing in line in the Porticus Minutia Frumentaria, the central grain distribution center in Rome. It's early morning. You carry a tessera frumentaria, a small inscribed token that proves your eligibility for the monthly grain ration. You approach the counter. A clerk checks your token against a list. Another weighs the grain measured in modii, a Roman unit roughly equal to 8.7 liters. A third records the transaction. You are handed your sack. You leave. This happened thousands of times a day. The process was standardized but not impersonal. Citizens knew the names of the clerks. Bribes were common. Delays were frustrating. The annona was both a lifeline and a bureaucratic obstacle course. Still, it worked, and it shaped the way Rome thought about citizenship. Access to grain wasn't a charity, it was a right, tied to one's identity as a Roman. Infrastructure of food, the horia. Rome's grain warehouses were marvels of engineering and organization. The Horia Galbi, near the Tiber, held up to 140 rooms across multiple buildings, storing grain, olive oil, wine, and other staples. The rooms were raised on platforms to prevent flooding and ventilated to reduce spoilage. Each room had inventory logs, sometimes carved into wooden tags, sometimes painted on walls. Slaves and freedmen worked in shifts to manage flow, incoming goods, sorting, inspection, and outgoing deliveries. Other horia specialized in different commodities: the horia pipertaria for spices, the horia chartaria for paper and writing supplies. But the grain stores were the most vital. If they failed, the city would starve. Grain from afar, the global logistics of Rome. Most of the grain consumed in Rome didn't come from Italy. It came from Egypt, Sicily, and Africa Proconsularis regions with surplus agricultural capacity and strong shipping lanes. The shipping season was dictated by weather. From March to November, ships loaded with grain crossed the Mediterranean, docking at Ostia or Portus, Rome's ports. There the grain was offloaded, inspected, taxed, and transported up the Tiber River to the city. Every sack was tagged, every load documented. Delays caused by weather or piracy could spark panic. Emperors who failed to ensure grain deliveries faced unrest or worse. The poet Juvenal once wrote that Roman citizens cared only for panem et circenses, bread and circuses, and the bread came first. To guarantee supply, emperors even built ships and hired private fleets, managed by state agents. By the time of Trajan, a full-blown logistical empire had developed, run by men with no battlefield glory, only well-inked scrolls. Regularity, stability, and the politics of the dole. The grain dole wasn't static. It changed with emperors, politics, and population shifts. Sometimes grain was replaced with bread, distributed from public bakeries. Other times, oil, pork, or wine were added. In the later empire under Aurelian, the state even provided free loaves of bread daily, increasing reliance on centralized systems. Critics complained. Some argued that the dole encouraged laziness or inflated the population. But emperors knew that a well-fed populace was a quiet populace. The Annona was not just about food, it was about order. You wake early in a room not warmed by firelight, but by the bustle of accountancy. A clerk sits hunched over a wax tablet. Another dips a stylus, marking tiny notations beside a stack of small wooden tokens. There is no shouting, no grandeur, just the sound of names being read, records being checked, and quantities tallied. Welcome to the Annona office, a place where numbers fed a nation. In this section, we move closer to the human machinery of Rome's grain distribution system. Not the statues or temples, but the men with dry fingers and tired eyes who calculated quotas, checked weights, inspected grain sacks, and scribbled in silence. They weren't famous. They didn't wear togas of state, but they were absolutely essential. This is the story of the logistics, tools, and people that kept Rome full, and the empire from falling into chaos. The art of the list, the ancient Roman database. To manage the grain dole effectively, Rome relied on a series of citizen registries, carefully maintained rolls, that listed the names of those entitled to receive rations. These lists were not casual. Eligibility was tied to Roman citizenship, which meant a person's inclusion on the dole roll was a mark of status. Each name was attached to an address, insula or district, a family head, the appropriate monthly allotment, a corresponding distribution station. Enrollment wasn't automatic. You had to apply, sometimes proving your citizenship or presenting witnesses. The list was updated annually. Errors were not uncommon and complaints were frequent, but the system was incredibly robust for its time. At designated distribution centers like the Porticus Minutia, Frumentaria clerks would reference these lists, matching recipients with tokens or tallies issued in advance. Tokens might be made of lead, bone, or pottery and inscribed with simple symbols, a number, an initial, a stylized stalk of wheat. They weren't currency, they were proof of access. Lose your token, and you might lose your grain. The quiet clerks of the empire. Who were these record keepers? Most were freedmen, former slaves who had been educated and now worked in government service. Many held low-level administrative titles: scriba, calculator, tabularius. Their tools were simple: wax tablets for short-term calculations, papyrus scrolls for permanent records, styluses made of bone or bronze, ink made from soot, gum, and water. Their job was to track quantities, monitor deliveries, prevent fraud, and balance the books. In a world before spreadsheets, this was done entirely by hand and largely by memory. Mistakes could cause food shortages. Clerical errors could lead to public anger. But still, they worked day after day, measuring, weighing, knotting. Standardization and the weight of accuracy. Roman grain was measured using standardized units. The most common was the modius, a container holding roughly 8.7 liters of dry grain. Distribution centers used calibrated baskets, bronze vessels, or wooden containers carved to specification. Inspectors monitored these tools, ensuring that no shortcuts were taken. Overmeasuring could deplete stores. Undermeasuring might incite riots. To enforce standards, some storage jars and containers had inscriptions like, "Approved by the Office of the Annona, Year 5 of Emperor Hadrian." Just as weights and measures are essential to commerce today, so too were they the keystone of trust in the Roman food system. Spoilage, fraud, and oversight. Not all grain was good grain. The Annona had to manage spoilage due to moisture or pests, moldy shipments from overseas, weevil infestations in granaries, diluted sacks where chaff was added to stretch rations. To combat this, supervisors performed regular inspections. Warehouses were ventilated and sometimes fumigated with smoke or spices. Grain was rotated to prevent stagnation. Still, fraud was inevitable. Some clerks sold extra tokens under the table. Others siphoned grain into side markets. Some millers underweighed flour or mixed in foreign grain of lower quality. The penalties were real fines, dismissal, even flogging in serious cases, but so were the temptations. The annona was, in every sense, a food economy, and its risks mirrored any modern system: theft, inefficiency, favoritism. Beyond grain, the expanded dole. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the annona expanded to include bread, olive oil, salt, wine, and even pork, distributed not as regularly as grain, but in designated cycles, often during festivals or public holidays. This required even more administration. Public bakeries produced standardized loaves. Olive oil was stored in amphorae, stamped with official marks. Salt rations, salarium, were distributed for free, eventually giving us the word salary. These additional goods were managed in parallel with grain, creating a complex layering of bureaucracies. Each had its own supply lines, storage challenges, and delivery schedules, but all fed into the idea that Rome fed its people. The urban footprint of food. The annona wasn't just administrative, it shaped the physical city. Distribution stations were scattered across districts, reducing crowding and travel time. Warehouses, horia, dominated entire neighborhoods. Bakeries became landmarks, with smoke rising from ovens at dawn. Public granaries served as both economic engines and symbols of imperial benevolence. The city's map was marked not only by temples and forums, but by the routes that food took to reach mouths. In this way, the bureaucracy of grain was also a kind of urban planning. You walk through a quiet courtyard in a once busy Roman horium, its clay walls crumbling, its massive doors ajar. Dust has settled where sacks once stood. A few fragments of painted writing cling to the bricks: warehouse markings, shipment codes, names of long-forgotten clerks. The silence here is telling. The system that once pulsed with life, that fed an empire, has slowed to a stop. In this final section, we follow the annona from its height to its transformation in late antiquity and its quiet imprint on the institutions that followed. We explore how a complex, bureaucratic food system adapted, frayed, and survived, leaving behind not structures or statues, but the idea that a state should feed its people. The annona in the later empire, adjustments and adaptations. As the Roman Empire moved into the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, pressures on the annona increased. Population shifts strained supply routes. Political instability disrupted shipping and administration. Currency inflation made the monetized parts of the dole unreliable. The system didn't collapse overnight, but it evolved. Under emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, the grain dole became increasingly centralized and militarized. Rather than relying on local administrators, imperial agents were dispatched to collect, store, and distribute grain, especially for the army. The annona militaris emerged as a parallel system, ensuring that troops were fed, even as urban centers like Rome began to see rationing shift from grain to bread or other prepared food. In many cases, the delivery of goods was replaced with compulsory services, where landowners were obligated to provide fixed quantities of goods or labor directly. Rome itself shrank. By the 5th century, its population had dropped significantly. The elaborate system of warehousing, milling, baking, and distribution began to deteriorate. But the idea of entitlement to food endured. The rise of the church and charitable distribution. As the Western Roman state weakened, another institution took its place in feeding the poor: the Christian church. In the 4th and 5th centuries, bishops of Rome began to take over aspects of urban welfare, including the distribution of bread and oil. Church inventories listed storehouses, mills, and even granaries, often the same facilities once used by the state. Food became tied not only to citizenship, but to Christian charity. By the time of Pope Gregory the Great, 6th century CE, the Church had developed an organized system of monthly food allotments for the poor of Rome. These weren't anonymous distributions, they were personalized, tracked through ledgers, and led by clerical staff. In many ways, the Church absorbed the Annona's administrative culture. Thus, the legacy of the Roman grain dole was preserved not in empire, but in religion. Echoes through time, bureaucracy as benevolence. Though the Annona eventually faded, its structure left lasting imprints. The Byzantine Empire retained state-organized grain shipments for Constantinople. In medieval cities like Venice and Florence, public granaries were established to stabilize bread prices and prepare for famine. The idea of rations during crisis evolved into state food control during wartime in Europe. Modern concepts of food stamps, school lunches, and government food subsidies owe philosophical debt to Rome's model. The key lesson: that food is not only sustenance but governance. The Roman grain dole did more than feed, it defined citizenship, reinforced loyalty, and demonstrated the state's power and responsibility. The hidden labor of empire. It's tempting to think of Rome in terms of marble forums and imperial decrees, but beneath it all was a massive system of unsung, repetitive labor. Men hauling grain sacks up narrow stairways. Women baking daily loaves in soot-blackened ovens. Clerks marking tokens, cross-referencing scrolls, and correcting errors with a smudge of wax. They didn't write history, but they made it possible. Without them, there would have been hunger, and with hunger, unrest. The grain dole may have been boring, but it fed civilization itself. Final reflection. When we speak of power, we often name emperors and armies, but perhaps true power lies in a warehouse near the river, where a man counts beans and tallies names not to conquer, but to sustain. In that quiet accounting lies the architecture of peace. Story 5. Salt roads and silent caravans trade in the Sahel. The air is dry, thinner than you expect, filled not with wind but stillness. The landscape stretches wide and flat, a horizon of ochre and stone, interrupted only by low dunes and faint mirages. In the distance, you see movement, a slow, deliberate procession of camels, laden with slabs of salt, walking one after another in a long line that seems to connect nothing to nothing. This is the Sahel, the transitional zone between the Sahara Desert and the savannas of sub-Saharan Africa. And for over 1,000 years, this region thrummed quietly with commerce, culture, and camel caravans that carried not silk or gold or spices but salt. This story unfolds not in the glitz of bustling ports or market cities, but on a path shaped by hooves, sweat, and silence. It's about a trade so essential, yet so mundane, that it often escapes attention. This is the story of the salt roads and the people who carved them into the dry crust of the earth, one footprint at a time. Why salt, the commodity of life? Salt today is cheap and omnipresent, but in pre-modern West Africa, it was life. The human body needs salt to function, especially in hot climates. Salt preserves food, makes it palatable, and replenishes nutrients lost in sweat. In the tropical zones of West Africa, salt was scarce. Rivers did not offer it. The soil did not produce it. Yet the northern deserts, barren though they seemed, held immense deposits, especially in places like Tagheza and Taoudeni in present-day Mali. Here, salt existed as slabs extracted from shallow mines, shaped into rectangular bricks, and stacked for transport. The resulting trade was not glamorous, but existential. It connected people across thousands of kilometers, linking the Mediterranean world to inland Africa through an invisible highway of survival. The caravan system, rhythms of the dunes. The camel, introduced to North Africa around the 3rd century CE, made this trade possible. Camels could carry hundreds of pounds, go days without water, and navigate sand-blown routes with uncanny instinct. By the 10th century, salt caravans had become a common, if rarely recorded, sight across the Sahel. These caravans, often numbering hundreds or even thousands of camels, moved with deliberate slowness about 25–30 kilometers per day. The journey from the salt mines to trade centers like Timbuktu, Gao, or Kano could take weeks, sometimes months. Every movement was calculated. Stops were made at ancient wells. Each caravan followed established seasonal paths, avoiding the most intense heat and sandstorms. The men who guided these caravans were known as azalai. Their job required not just stamina, but memory of routes, landmarks, watering holes, and wind patterns. Each trip carried not just salt, but also information, news, prayers, and songs traded quietly under the desert sky. The salt mines, labor and landscape. Two of the most famous salt mines in West African history are Tagheza and Taoudeni, both located deep within the Malian Sahara. Tagheza, mentioned by 14th century traveler Ibn Battuta, was a place built entirely of salt blocks. The air stung with salt dust. Workers lived in crude shelters, digging shallow pits with basic tools. Water had to be imported from hundreds of kilometers away. Food was sparse. Life was harsh. And yet, this tiny outpost produced the material that fueled economies hundreds of miles to the south. The salt slabs were chiseled and shaped by hand, stacked into camel loads, often 3 slabs per beast, marked with symbols to indicate quality or origin. Slabs could weigh 20–30 kilograms each. Even a modest caravan might carry several tons of salt. There was no coinage here, no scales of gold, only rectangles of compacted mineral, exchanged slowly under an open sky. Trade without maps, navigation by memory. The desert offers few signposts. The caravans relied on oral knowledge passed down through generations. There were no compasses, instead guides used. Star positions for night travel. Rock formations as landmarks. Animal droppings, wind directions, and subtle terrain shifts as navigational clues. Caravans rarely strayed from known paths. To do so meant death by dehydration, disorientation, or banditry. Despite the silence of the route, the complexity of human coordination was immense. Traders negotiated handovers. Camels were swapped. Agreements were made in spoken contracts, sealed not with ink but with honor and repetition. Markets at the edge, the meeting of worlds. Eventually, the salt reached Sahelian trade hub cities like Timbuktu, Djenné, Gao, and Walata. These were not just dusty outposts but sophisticated urban centers, where merchants, scholars, clerics, and rulers met. Salt was exchanged for gold mined in forests to the south, kola nuts used in rituals and medicine, textiles imported from the Mediterranean, books, especially religious texts from Cairo and beyond. Markets were regulated. Prices fluctuated with season and demand. In some years, salt was worth its weight in gold. In others, it was simply a necessity. Even after centuries of trade, the structures remained the same. Salt moved south, gold moved north, and the desert carried them both one slab, one hoofprint at a time. Final thought for Section 1. How do you measure the value of something so plain, so heavy, and so necessary that it moves nations not with speed or spectacle, but with the quiet, grinding patience of hooves across sand? The caravan has reached its destination. The air is still dry, but now it carries other scents: wood smoke, roasted millet, and distant incense. You're standing in Timbuktu, or perhaps Djenné, in the 14th century. Dust drifts along the baked roads. Traders unload camels and greet one another not with gold or coins, but with slabs of salt. Here, far from the silence of the desert, the salt trade transforms. What began as physical labor and long-distance endurance now becomes accounting, ritual, and politics. This section explores the administrative and cultural worlds shaped by salt. We move from camel trails to royal courts, and from the backs of beasts to scribes, ledgers. In doing so, we discover that even the most ordinary substance can be the heart of complex systems: economic, religious, and intellectual. Salt and statecraft, the Empire of Mali. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mali Empire dominated a vast region of West Africa, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the edges of the Sahara. Its rulers, most famously Mansa Musa, understood that power did not lie solely in military strength, but in controlling trade routes and especially controlling salt. Towns like Walata, Tegdeost, Gao, and Timbuktu became nodes in a vast, silent network. Salt was taxed at every step. The empire collected levies on caravans, duties on markets, and fees for passage. These taxes were not recorded in modern currency, but in slabs of salt, counted and stacked in secure storehouses. Salt became part of tribute. Governors owed it to kings. Kings offered it as gifts to allies. Diplomacy flowed not only in words and gestures, but in carefully arranged piles of mineral wealth. And when Mansa Musa made his legendary Hajj to Mecca in 1324, bringing thousands of attendants and camels laden with gold, it was the profits from salt and gold that made it possible. Scribes and scrolls, the bureaucracy of the Sahel. Commerce, even in a world of oral contracts, needed record keeping. In the great cities of the Sahel, scribes wrote in Arabic, the lingua franca of trade and religion. Markets were regulated, prices were tracked, ledgers were kept. Salt was documented with the same care as gold. Weight, quality, and origin were recorded. Buyers and sellers were listed. Transactions were witnessed, and in some cases, sealed with thumbprints or verbal affirmations. In Timbuktu's Sankore quarter, scholars and merchants operated side by side. Salt shipments were sometimes accompanied by notes, brief letters of introduction, receipts, or even legal opinions, fatwas, on trade ethics. Libraries in Timbuktu contain centuries-old documents referring to salt prices, caravan losses, and market disputes. These aren't tales of empire and war. They're the fine print of trade, the kind of quiet, practical paperwork that sustains civilizations. Education and economy, salt as fuel for learning. The wealth that flowed into Sahelian cities via the salt trade funded scholarship. In Timbuktu, Djenné, and Gao, the proceeds from caravan taxation paid for the construction of mosques and madrasas, the hearing of teachers and jurists, the importation of books from North Africa, Egypt, and Andalusia. In this way, salt became a patron of knowledge. Scholars debated theology, law, medicine, and astronomy in clay buildings roofed with wood and mud. Students copied texts by hand, sometimes on parchment made from sheep or goat hide imported, again, along the same trade routes as salt. Salt made cities rich, but it also made them curious. It connected ideas as much as it connected goods. Salt and faith, ritual and symbol. Salt's importance wasn't merely nutritional or economic. It carried symbolic power in West African Islamic traditions, and likely in pre-Islamic cultures as well. Salt was used in ritual purification, sprinkled to ward off evil spirits, added to offerings and treaties, often as a sign of sincerity, buried with the dead, or given to travelers as protection. Even outside formal religion, salt served as a kind of spiritual infrastructure, quietly linking bodies, landscapes, and prayers. To carry salt across the desert was not just hard labor, it was, in a sense, a ritual act repeated endlessly, season after season. The ethical code of the Azali. The Azali, or salt caravanners, were not only navigators but men of deep custom and responsibility. Though few written records exist from their own hands, oral traditions describe a strict ethical code. Camels were fed before men. Water was rationed by need, not rank. A man who lost his camel could still expect aid from others. theft from another caravan, was grounds for exile or worse. The desert demanded cooperation. Even caravans from rival cities often shared wells or offered assistance during storms. Trust became currency, honor became infrastructure. In a world where written contracts were rare, reputation was everything. A caravan leader who betrayed a promise might find himself excluded from future expeditions, a fate worse than punishment. Weights of the world, measuring value in salt. In some Sahelian towns, salt was not just a traded good, it became a unit of account. Prices were given in bricks of salt, taxes were assessed in slices, workers were paid in crumbs. The slab, roughly 25 to 30 kilograms, was broken and redistributed as needed. Salt could buy livestock, iron tools, fabric, slaves. But it was fragile, slabs chipped, edges wore down. They had to be handled carefully, stored in dry rooms, and protected during transport. Still, the system endured. For hundreds of years, salt circulated in place of coin, carrying with it all the weight of economy, symbolism, and survival. Final thought for Section 2. What happens when the most vital commodity isn't dazzling or rare but humble, heavy, and necessary? Perhaps the real power lies not in what glitters, but in what endures, mile after mile, across silent dunes. The caravan returns home. The salt has been traded, the camels lightened, and the hooves retrace their route across dunes and stone. No monuments mark the journey. No statues celebrate the guides. But deep in the sand, where the winds have yet to erase the footprints, lies the memory of a civilization that moved quietly on the weight of salt. In this final section, we explore how the Sahel's salt trade changed over time, how it faded from prominence, and how its rhythms still echo today. Not in slabs and caravans, but in markets, place names, oral histories, and the resilient patterns of trade and life that desert winds could never fully bury. Changing routes, changing powers. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the political and commercial landscape of West Africa began to shift. The Songhai Empire rose, centered around Gao, absorbing much of the Mali Empire's salt trade infrastructure. Salt still flowed, but control passed to new administrators. Caravans were organized differently. Taxes changed. Markets expanded. Yet the basic patterns of salt trade, mining in the desert, transport by camel, exchange in the Sahel, remained largely the same. Then the Atlantic world began to intrude. New trade routes opened along the coast. Europeans arrived seeking gold, slaves, and ivory, bypassing inland systems. Caravans lost their monopoly. Political fragmentation, climate change, and colonial interventions eroded the foundations of the traditional trans-Saharan trade. But it didn't disappear. In many places, it simply contracted inward, becoming local, more modest, more fragile, but still alive. Taoudeni, the mine that would not die. Even as empires fell, the salt mines continued to operate, especially Taoudeni, which by the 20th century remained one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. There, men still cut slabs by hand, using wooden tools and bare strength. Camels were still loaded with salt, and caravans, though smaller, still made their seasonal journeys to Timbuktu and beyond. The trade became symbolic. Fewer people relied on it for daily salt, but many revered it as a connection to heritage. The Azali were not just traders, they became cultural carriers, sustaining a memory with each hoofprint. Even today, a small number of caravans leave Taoudeni every year, watched by tourists, documented by photographers, but operated by men whose grandfathers and great-grandfathers followed the same line across the sand. Colonial erasure and cultural persistence. During the colonial period, French authorities sought to centralize and modernize trade, imposing new taxes and redirecting commerce to coastal ports. Caravans were dismissed as backward. Salt mines were regulated or abandoned. Oral contracts were replaced by written documents often in foreign languages. But the practical knowledge of the salt roads persisted, passed from elder to youth. Berber, Tuareg, and Songhai oral traditions kept the maps alive not on paper, but in songs, proverbs, and desert lore. Even where roads were paved and plastic bags replaced camel saddlebags, the mental infrastructure remained. Trade, movement, endurance, these remained values long after salt stopped flowing in great blocks. Modern memory, salt in story and place. In cities like Timbuktu, once a major hub of salt exchange, the trade has become more symbolic than material, but its memory is deeply woven into local identity. Schools and businesses carry names like Azalai or Caravan. Elder storytellers recount desert journeys in evening gatherings. Musicians reference caravan rhythms in traditional instruments and songs. Salt slabs are sold as souvenirs. Museums house remnants of old tools. Documentaries capture the fatting art of camel caravan management. Even the silence of the desert has become part of the narrative, a silence full of memory, shaped by countless footsteps that pressed down and vanished. Urban echoes, the shape of trade in the modern Sahel. Though salt is now mined and shipped more efficiently, the patterns of commerce born of the salt roads live on in modern West African markets. Goods are still exchanged in bundled quantities, measured not in precision but familiarity. Informal contracts, based on trust and repetition, persist in rural areas. Caravan-like supply chains, using motorcycles and small trucks, have replaced camels in some regions, but retain the same rhythm of distribution. Markets in Gao, Agadez, and Zinder still follow the logic of desert trade, nodal points connected by slow, steady movement through open terrain. Legacy without monuments. The salt trade left behind no cathedrals, no colosseums, no stone-paved forums. Its monuments are roots, rhythms, and relationships. Its builders were not architects, but herders, miners, traders, and clerics. Its archives lie not in marble libraries, but in sand-blown ledgers, recited genealogies, and the weathered bodies of camels. Yet in the long arc of history, few institutions endured so quietly or connected so many worlds across such distance and time. Final reflection. What if greatness lies not in the structures we build, but in the paths we walk again and again, in the repetition of effort, the honoring of custom, and the movement of something as simple and necessary as salt? Story 6. Onions and order the menu of a 17th century French monastery. It's early morning in rural France, sometime in the 1660s. The bell has rung once already, not to signal prayer yet but to stir the kitchen. A faint smell of wood smoke hangs in the air, rising from a modest hearth at the edge of the monastic grounds. Somewhere, a monk stirs onions into a pot, slicing them thinly with methodical patience. You are in a Benedictine monastery, deep in the countryside, far from courts and cities. But what's happening here, what's simmering, soaking, fermenting, and boiling, is central to understanding how Europe ate, fasted, and survived through centuries of tradition. This is not a story about gourmet cuisine. It's a story about routine, discipline, and faith, all stewed in onions and broth. It's about how monks shaped medieval and early modern food culture through quiet consistency. No grand banquets, just a schedule, a spoon, and a slowly aging wheel of cheese. The rule of St. Benedict, food as order. Monastic life in the Benedictine tradition was governed by the rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century. By the 17th century, the rule had been interpreted and reinterpreted, but one idea remained central: to eat at the proper times and not to excess. Food wasn't meant to be enjoyed, but endured in moderation, in silence, and in common. Meals were not personal events. They were communal rituals, governed by bells, prayers, and reading. In practice, this meant 2 meals per day. usually around 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. No meat of four-footed animals, except for the sick. No talking during meals instead. A monk read aloud from scripture or hagiographies. Limited portions, often fixed by the abbot. The kitchen was sacred, not for its creativity but for its obedience. Onions, pulses, and porridge, the ingredients of abstinence. The ingredients available to a 17th century French monastery were not exotic. They were local, seasonal, and humble, but carefully chosen to meet the dietary and theological requirements of the rule. Here are the staples. Onions and leeks, used in nearly every dish, easy to grow, long shelf life. Lentils, peas, and beans, rich in protein, ideal substitutes for meat. Barley and oats, for porridge or bread often coarsely ground. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and carrots were common. Cabbage and leafy greens, grown in monastic gardens year-round. Fish, permitted often especially salted herring or freshwater varieties. Cheese, often homemade, aged, and used sparingly. Wine and ale, consumed moderately and always with a blessing. Fasting days frequent in the liturgical calendar restricted even these. On those days, monks might consume only one meal, often without fats or cooked ingredients. Still, the meals were carefully balanced. The Kitchen Brothers understood nutrition, even if they didn't name it as such. They planned meals to avoid weakness, maintain health, and keep the community functioning without excess or indulgence. The refectory, ritual in the dining room. The refectory was the dining room, and it was as much a liturgical space as the chapel. Monks entered in silence, often after chanting the noon office. They stood behind their seats, waited for a blessing, then sat. One monk read aloud while the others ate slowly, without eye contact or noise. Dishes were standardized and served on simple wooden or pewter plates. Meals ended with a bell or prayer, and everyone filed out, heads bowed. This was not a place of conversation or enjoyment. It was spiritual fuel. The food itself was often stewed together, a thick onion-based pottage or lentil mash flavored with herbs, sometimes accompanied by stale bread soaked in broth. Variety was minimal. The goal was sufficiency, not satisfaction. The kitchen hierarchy and labor. Running a monastic kitchen required labor, and that labor was spiritual. The role of kitchen brother rotated every week in many monasteries. This ensured that no monk became overly attached to comfort or to power. Duties included rising before matins to start fires and bread, managing root cellar storage, tending herb and vegetable gardens, brewing small beer or mild wine, scrubbing pots, which were often iron or earthenware. Food scraps were fed to pigs or composted. Bones, when used, were boiled down for broth or ground into powder for the infirmary. Nothing was wasted. The kitchen functioned not just as a source of food, but as a space of discipline, humility, and service. To chop onions in silence was to participate in divine order. Cleanliness, preservation, and food safety. Even centuries before germ theory, monastic kitchens had strict standards of cleanliness. These came not from science, but from scriptural and monastic tradition. Some daily tasks: washing vegetables in multiple basins, scrubbing tables and knives after every use, keeping raw and cooked items separate, observed even then, salting or drying surplus produce for winter, carefully rotating cheese and fermented goods. Preservation techniques included drying beans and peas, salt curing fish, storing grains in sealed bins, cellaring onions and garlic in dark, dry rooms. Monasteries were often islands of food safety during periods of urban disease or famine, due in part to this consistency and care. A theology of simplicity. Behind every bite was an idea: simplicity is strength. To deny the body was to feed the soul. A monk who craved elaborate meals might fall into gluttony or distraction. The rule demanded temperance not just in quantity, but in desire. This belief gave rise to a culinary minimalism that echoed throughout European history. Sparing use of spices, no elaborate sauces, avoidance of novelty in recipes, celebration of local, seasonal eating. The monastery's onion pottage wasn't just a recipe, it was a statement of faith. Final thought for Section 1. What happens to a meal when it is stripped of pleasure, excess, and conversation, when all that remains is nourishment, rhythm, and prayer? Does food lose its meaning, or does it perhaps gain another? The seasons turn. Outside the cloister walls, peasants harvest wheat, rivers freeze, and pilgrims arrive with stories of distant abbeys. But within the monastery, the rhythm remains steady, governed not by whim, weather, or appetite, but by the liturgical calendar. In this section, we explore how time itself was measured in meals, how days of fasting, feasting, abstinence, and celebration formed a culinary rhythm that mirrored the rhythms of devotion and prayer. In a monastery, a year was not simply winter, spring, summer, fall. It was Advent, Lent, Eastertide, and ordinary time, and each period carried its own menu of obligation. The liturgical year as a cookbook. The liturgical year shaped the monastery's table more deeply than any seasonal produce list. The Benedictines did not eat what they wanted, they ate what the calendar allowed. Here's a simplified outline of how time affected taste. Advent and Lent, fasting seasons. No meat or animal fats. Limited dairy. One full meal per day, often in the evening. Emphasis on vegetables, legumes, dried fruits, and bread. Meals were quieter, even more austere. Easter and Christmas seasons, feasting periods. Multiple courses allowed, though still simple. Fish, eggs, and cheese served more generously. Baked goods such as almond bread or fruit tarts permitted on specific days. Meals slightly longer, with extended readings. Ordinary time, most of the year. Basic two-meal structure. Continued avoidance of meat, but more flexibility with local produce and preserved goods. Each period was theological in the kitchen. The monks fasted not out of nutritional theory, but out of repentance, humility, and memory, especially during Lent, when Christ's 40 days in the desert were mirrored in foodless simplicity. The great fish exception. While meat was forbidden on most days, fish stood as a divinely sanctioned loophole. Monasteries near rivers or coasts often had access to eel, considered nearly a delicacy. Herring, heavily salted and preserved. Pike, carp, or perch, caught fresh or pickled. Occasionally, shellfish such as mussels or snails. Inland monasteries would salt and dry fish in advance, then soak it in water before preparation. Dishes included fish stews with barley, fish pies with leeks and herbs, cold fish with vinegar and onion. Some monks went a great lengths to classify animals as fish. Beaver tails, for instance, were deemed aquatic and thus permissible during fasts. This flexible reasoning shows that even rigid rules allowed for adaptation and regional interpretation. The role of herbs, oil, and preserved flavor. Although spices were used sparingly in monasteries, largely due to cost and ascetic ideals, flavor still mattered in modest ways. Herbs grew in nearly every monastic garden. Thyme, parsley, sage, marjoram. Used to flavor soups and stews. Added to cheeses or infused into oils. Oil was made from walnuts in the north, olives in the south, or purchased through trade. Pickled vegetables, onion vinegar, and herb-salted water added depth to otherwise bland meals. But the goal remained balance, not indulgence. A well-prepared turnip stew was a quiet act of devotion, not a culinary triumph. Feast days, when the menu briefly changed. On special feast days, especially those honoring saints, the monastery permitted modest celebration. This might include fresh bread baked with eggs or honey, fruit stews with figs, raisins, or apples, baked cheeses or soft young curds, tarts using leftover grain or sweetened vegetable pastes, a glass of stronger wine, sipped slowly and ceremonially. Still, these were temporary departures, never lapses. The abbot maintained oversight. The purpose was not pleasure but gratitude. Sometimes, monks even invited laypeople or pilgrims to share these meals, briefly turning the quiet table into a communal act of hospitality. Recipe books and memory. Unlike courtly kitchens, monastic food was rarely written down in elaborate cookbooks, but some manuscript fragments survive, usually in marginalia or scribes' notes. These recipes are not ornate. Boil peas, add leek salt, let rest. Mash beans, mix with oil, bake on stone. Slice onion thin, cook in pot until clear, add broth. The simplicity masks deep generational knowledge. Each brother learned through repetition, observation, and gentle correction. Kitchens did not innovate, they remembered. Even centuries later, descendants of these methods appear in regional dishes. French onion soup, lentil stews, and even rustic breads with herbs trace their flavor profiles to these quiet kitchens. The spiritual meaning of enough. To a modern mind, the idea of voluntarily limiting food variety and flavor might seem alien. But to the monks, this limitation was a form of freedom. Fewer choices meant fewer distractions. Fewer ingredients meant more consistency. And repetition meant focus on the divine, on the collective, and on the passage of time itself. The kitchen became a mirror of the chapel. The meal became a form of prayer. Final thought for Section 2. If we build a calendar from feast and fast, from grain and broth, how do we measure a year? Not in flavors or courses, but in the gentle, sacred rhythm of what is enough. The kitchen is still. The broth has cooled, the fire's coals have dimmed to gray, and the bowls sit stacked clean but imperfect. A bell rings distantly across the cloister, calling not to table but to vespers, evening prayer, another day of service and silence, digestion and devotion. As we close the story of the monastic table, we turn to its slow decline, its unexpected influence, and its quiet legacy not only in religious history, but in the very structure of how we understand meals, labor, and order. The monks of 17th century France cooked not for recognition, but for survival and spiritual discipline. Yet the echoes of their meals remain, long after their tables were abandoned. Decline of the kitchen, decline of the order. By the late 17th century, many monastic houses across France, particularly Benedictine and Cistercian, were facing internal and external pressure. A growing French state, increasingly centralized under Louis XIV, viewed independent monastic lands and privileges with suspicion. The Catholic Reformation spurred internal reforms, calling for stricter adherence to the rule of Saint Benedict. Meanwhile, urbanization and the rise of secular knowledge pulled younger generations away from monastic vocations. This had consequences in the kitchen. Monasteries that had once been self-sufficient ecosystems began to rely on purchased food. Lay brothers or hired laborers took over kitchen tasks. Recipes changed. Imported goods arrived. Meat began to appear more frequently, not just for the infirm, but for guests and administrators. While some abbots resisted these changes, others welcomed them, believing that a modern kitchen reflected a modern faith. Yet in many places, something was lost: the deliberate repetition, the theological restraint, the quiet measurement of enough. Secularization and revolution. Empty kitchens. The French Revolution, 1789–1799, accelerated this unraveling. Revolutionary leaders saw monastic communities as symbolic of inequality, economically unproductive, politically suspicious. Thousands of monasteries were dissolved, their properties seized. Monks were expelled, libraries were looted, and the kitchens once kept in such careful rhythm were abandoned. Some monasteries became barns, prisons, or schools. Others were left to decay. Their gardens overgrew, their fermentation pots cracked in the frost, their bread ovens cooled for the last time. No rebellion stormed the kitchen directly, but the revolution extinguished the table as a site of holy restraint, replacing it with different orders: military, industrial, modern. A lasting influence on European food culture. And yet, the monks' legacy did not vanish, it diffused. Even after their dissolution, monastic culinary habits survived in regional cooking traditions that mirror fasting day meals, preserved foods like cheese, wine, and ale, which often have monastic origins, recipe structures based on simplicity, seasonality, and frugality. In fact, the monastic rhythm "eat simply, eat together, eat at appointed times" may have shaped the very structure of European domestic dining, particularly among the rural poor and middle classes. Even the idea of institutional kitchen schools, hospitals, armies owes something to the efficiency and morality of the cloistered cook. Modern resurgence, monastic food as heritage. Today, several monastic orders still exist in France and across Europe, many of them small, contemplative, and open to visitors. Their kitchens now serve dual purposes: internal discipline for the brothers and sisters who live there, cultural heritage for visitors seeking a glimpse of the past. You might buy Trappist cheeses still aged in silent cellars, herbal liqueurs brewed using centuries-old techniques, cookbooks based loosely on monastic manuscripts and oral traditions. These offerings are not simply products. They are echoes, tangible links to a worldview in which meals were tools of prayer, and onions could be as sacred as scripture. The philosophy of the scrubbed bowl. Perhaps the most enduring monastic lesson isn't in what was cooked, but in how meals were treated once finished. Every bowl was washed by hand, stacked uniformly, put away with reverence. No food was wasted, no detail overlooked. This repetition without recognition taught humility, a daily return to the basics, regardless of status, mood, or season. Even the abbot might scrub a pan if needed. This ethic has faded in modern kitchens, but it survives quietly in hospital cafeterias, military mess halls, and retreat centers, places where food is fuel and structure is sacred. Final reflection. What do we remember when we remember a meal? Is it the taste or the silence that surrounded it, the ingredients or the rhythm of their repetition? Perhaps the truest flavor of monastic food lies not in the pot, but in the principle that to eat simply together and in time is a kind of prayer.